speaker series event today. This is our last speaker series event, and we saved the best for last. So I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Candice Shelby. She is professor of philosophy here at SUNY Denver, and she has a whole slew of publications relevant to her talk today on rethinking addiction, but most recently she's published a book through Palgrave called Addiction, Philosophical Perspective. And so anyway, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Candice Shelby.
Hi everybody, you can hear me, right? I'm very loud, it's not usually a problem. I'm glad to see everybody here today, more people than I had expected, but we're fine. So, let me just start. At the Nobel Conference last September, Eric and Denise Kandel took on Carl Hart, a neuroscientist tenured in 2 departments at Columbia, and Mark Lewis, who is a neuroscientist and full professor newly retired from the University of Toronto and Radboud in the Netherlands, not to mention Sheila Murphy and sociologist Owen Flanagan, a philosopher. Now, you might know Eric Kandel because he's won the Nobel Prize in psychology for biological psychology, and his wife does the same kind of work that he does. So among other things, Eric Kandel told these neuroscientists who pointed to social factors and psychological level factors like attachment, isolation, meaning or meaninglessness in lives, that they needed to take a course in biology. Now, you know how many courses in biology you have to be a neuroscientist, so this was really rough, right? He was being really cutting. He argued repeatedly, he's a nice little man, I don't know what's the deal. He argued repeatedly, though, that anything other than the biochemical level of analysis of addiction was fluff and not getting at the real cause and nature of addiction. As a philosopher, like Owen Flanagan, who was also on that panel, I take phrases like the real causes and nature of things to be my purview, not his. So, some other writers have moved pretty far away from Kandel and from NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, the national agency's position, and fortunately far away from the question of is it a disease or a choice. As with all wicked problems that we find in economics, environmental studies, political philosophy, that particular question is obviated by any serious look at the issue. It's not a question open to an answer like that. But people continue that approach, or they seek other oversimplified, single-shot types of solutions. Johann Hari, for example, author of the book Chasing the Scream, First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, and the well-circulated Huffington Post article, The Likely Cause of Addiction Has Been Discovered, and It's Not What You Think. And he's got a TED Talk by the same name that was also very popular. He says that the cause is social isolation and hopelessness. He leans heavily on Bruce Alexander's rat park experiments in his analysis. Oh, by the way, if anybody wants to stop me at any point and talk about anything, just raise your hand and we can always interrupt. I don't mind. If you want me to just keep going, I'll do the whole thing and then we'll do all the questions at the end, but I'm not particular about that. Anyways, Johann Hari leans on this set of rat park experiments. If you don't know what they are, I'll tell you afterwards. But I want to tell you, Hari was very, very popular. Big TED Talk. People all say, oh, it's social isolation. That is the cause of addiction. But you got to remember that this guy was suspended as a journalist for the Independent, from the Independent for plagiarism, and then he was forced to make a public apology for making improper edits to his Wikipedia page under a pseudonym. So that not everybody who comes out and is the most popular and the most read or whatever is actually the most responsible or respectable. Mia Salovitz, in another recent book, The Unbroken Chain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction. Now, I know all about her book because I got at least 100 emails from my friends saying, did you see this? Did you hear this podcast, the interview with Terry Gross on NPR? Yeah, I did. And she was very well received also, although she's not a scientist either. She has an addiction. She's a former addict, though, and so she got some credibility in terms of phenomenology, but she thinks that addiction is a learning disorder. Like Mark Lewis, the neuroscientist I mentioned earlier, she thinks that learning unfortunate connections is at the heart of addiction, and that can be a good thing, because plasticity of the brain and learning never stop, as we know now in adult brains, and so we can always learn more. And since people show growth and volume in prefrontal cortical matter after recovery from addiction, she thinks that addiction can be a good thing in the long run, because most addicts recover. There's a problem with that science, a serious problem with that science, but she's not a scientist. I mention this again because this is another very popular move away from the scientific theories that I covered last week in a talk in psychology, and I didn't want to cover this week because I'm tired of saying that. So I thought I would come say this. So addiction, right, certainly involves learning, particularly if we're talking about Hebbian learning, which is the only kind that the Candells apparently recognized. It involves synaptic strengthening and other sources of brain plasticity, as well as indications of larger than usual amounts of dopamine in areas of the mesocortical limbic system associated with seeking and reward. I guess I didn't cut that part out of the psychology talk, sorry. And addiction is also very sensitive to the social environment. Nobody failed to note the lack of attraction that morphine had for happy rats raised with their happy little rat friends in little rat playgrounds relative to those rats raised in isolating ordinary cages and tested in usual ways, which involve putting them on a little platform, they stick, they can't move anywhere, you put a needle in their head and then they push a lever or they don't. But you know, if I was stuck on a platform like that and had nothing to do but push a lever or not, I'd kill myself with drugs too. So it's not necessarily indicative of what you're looking at when you're saying that brain changes are the source, are addiction. That's the problem, is the identity. So when you take those same rats out and you give them enriched environments and things to do and people to play with and all of that, and then you give them the opportunity to drink morphine water, they won't. They'll drink the regular water. They'll prefer it even when you put a lot of sugar in it, and rats love sugar. So there's something not automatic about this kind of addiction process that some animal models would suggest is the case. So, as easily dismissed as these theories of addiction might seem, particularly as I've contextualized them, they're just the newest versions of reductionistic causal processes, approaches that we've been seeing since, well, basically since AA decided that addiction was a disease in the 1930s. But more importantly, it's been recognized or called, I don't think that addiction is a disease, I think the question's a bad question, but especially since the animal models and the scanning technology, the scanning processes started in the 80s and 90s, that's really been sort of the model of addiction, as it is these brain changes. Now, that view's been expressed in a number of theories, including characterization as a hedonic indulgence with subsequent tolerance phenomena, a kind of habituation, automated behavior, as a kind of withdrawal avoidance, or what they call opponent process theory, then as a particular kind of sensitization. They call that salient sensitivity, and I'll talk to you later about that if you want. But most of these theories include some kind of role for cognitive load, for ego depletion. That is, the fact that when we're really tired or we're stressed or we have too much to do, we fall into whatever is the fallback pattern, whatever is our ordinary pattern, the default. So if you're accustomed to going to sleep when you're too stressed, then you automatically will. So addicts may be able to do very well until they're stressed or they're pressed or they're too hungry or they're too tired. And then the idea of ego depletion is they have nothing left to use to resist their urges, and so they will give in those cases. Now, at the psychological level, other kinds of approaches, like game theoretic and pico-economic or interpersonal bargaining kinds of approaches, also say something true about addiction. Now, the scientific theories that involve scanning and microbiology share, all of them, dependent on the metaphor of the natural reward systems being hijacked in some way by drugs that in one way or another make a lot of dopamine available to relevant parts of the brain, as well as they also rely on plasticity of the brain in terms of synaptic learning and adaptation to all that extra dopamine by reduction of dopamine receptors, which means you need more in order to get the same amount available inside the cells. But this received view answers only a certain set of questions with respect to addiction. And it answers them through experiments that involve either animal models or scanning technology of some sort, and so involve at their very core interpretation and extrapolation from the conclusions actually warranted by their experiments. So they're saying a lot more than their experiments justify. Now I can talk about these theories and or the experiments and the claims that are drawn from them later if you want, but for us today, what's important is that each of these physiological accounts stops short of giving us an account of situated human beings' experiences with addiction. I used to think that was a good thing. I used to agree with these people who want to do reductionist theories, and I no longer do. I provide in that book, this book, and in some, whatever the book is, and in a talk that I've done in the philosophy department several years ago, and so in some other talks I've done, I talk about the sort of metaphysical thing that I think is true, which allows for minds to emerge and psychological experiences to emerge from minds, and social influences to shape minds and all of that. So I'm just going to assume all of that right now because there's not time to talk about everything. Now, the social neuroscientists, these people and others in other interdisciplinary fields have in recent years been trying to fit together some of these pieces of various biosocial, psychological problems like addiction, and they take note of the factors that got my own research started. How prone to addiction a person might be, for example, can be associated with the presence or absence of certain alleles, and there have to be a number of them. And by the way, alleles just are an alternative form of a gene that can be found at the same place as that gene on a chromosome, but they have to come in large batches. There is no gene for addiction. Likewise, stress hormones present during pregnancy can sensitize or predispose a child to addiction later. Other epigenetic factors can do the same thing. Incomplete or over-attachment to a caregiver. Trauma experienced early on, particularly social trauma, like separation from caregivers early on. But any of the adverse childhood experiences that are listed in that very, very famous study that all the school counselors now use will increase a person's predisposition to addictions, as will early exposure to drugs or to particular patterns of drug use. So listen to this, students. Binge use of drugs and alcohol on the weekend is way worse for you in terms of sensitizing you to addictive patterns than drinking all the time or using all the time. And the reason is the same reason as the person who's the sociopath with intermittent rewards making you feel really loved and cared for and then using you all your life really is attractive. And so that person who's a horrible human being is the one person you fall for every time. That's another version of the same addictive pattern. That is, there's big reward intermittently, right? So then it's taken away, and then you get, oh, I have to deal with this. Something happened bad last night, I feel bad this time. The next time, boom, another, right? Another binge, you feel great. That pattern is far worse than the pattern of, drinking wine with your dinner every night or having a cocktail every night or something like that. I'm not saying anything about anybody's liver. I'm just saying. Okay, so the point of all that is that the social neuroscientists seem to be taking the right approach, although there are some things that even they smooth over, and of course that's naturally going to happen. So, what's useful, I think, from the kind of analysis that I provided, both in terms, in the sort of metaphysical background that I presuppose, is that it allows us to understand mind as neither distinct from nor reducible to body. When I've numbered all the things in the world, for example, I will have numbered all the things. There's nothing extra that we might call mind. But there are, in addition to things, relations among those things. And those relations are not merely incidental. Rather, they're all important because they constrain what can emerge from them, and that means they constrain the nature of the structures that follow at higher levels of analysis. So, ideas, beliefs, emotions, all the other psychological phenomena, including addiction, can be understood as patterns essentially upheld by and upholding and integrated with other patterns operating in complex mutual causal loops. This means that mind is also not separable from the environment in which it develops. The view that I support is also a naturalistic, the view that I support can also consistently allow social systems as well as biochemistry, as well as experiences, to have explanatory value with respect to the phenomenon of addiction. So let's look at some social systems, because that's the part I wanted to talk about today. It's within culture that we learn to smoke, to drink, and to use drugs. Without addicted laborers, some of whom were paid in kind for producing the very substance to which they were addicted, the global markets in tobacco, which started in the 17th century, and caffeine products like coffee and tea could not have arisen. Not to mention the smaller but significant opium, cannabis, and coca markets. The use of these substances played a large role in keeping laborers laboring and markets growing. Chinese colonizers, think about Singapore, allowed monopolies to be created and protected for the sale of opium, sometimes keeping half or more of the workers' wages as proceeds from that sale. And the U.S., who used coolies, these Chinese workers, for railroad building on the West Coast, learned from them. We shouldn't underestimate the profitability of the sales and the taxes on these substances. By the mid-20th century, coffee trailed only oil as the world's most widely traded commodity, and a full third of the world's population was smoking cigarettes. And Americans were buying 15,000 of them a minute. Wow. No, a second. Sorry, I misread my note. The coffee break became an institution in America's white-collar factory. Today, given the DSM-5's inclusion of food addiction among its listed disorders, we might add the fast food market to this list. Low-wage earning fast food workers often take advantage of readily available, cheap and fast food saturated with fat and salt because it suits their schedule and their pocketbook. The discounts or the free food they often receive at such jobs suggest that the corporations for which they work find the arrangement mutually convenient. Just like the Gap will give you a wonderful discount on your clothes so that you spend your paycheck at the Gap. Same thing, right, with these foods. And we find that people are addicted to these foods. Notice that the kinds of drugs that didn't enter the world market in this way, peyote, mescaline, psilocybin, other types of hallucinogens. That's because while swilling stale beer, chewing coca leaves wouldn't bother those overseeing workers in the field or in the jungle, the fact was, and in fact were practices useful for keeping workers working and for keeping them peasants, hallucinogens don't promote control in the same way. Also, as the ability to refine even the drugs that had been tolerated, you can see why they're going to give opium leaves to tea pickers in China and India, because that is horrible work. Tea plants grow really low. And so they're doing this constantly, but if you don't want them to just fall over and quit because they're in so much pain, you give them something to keep them going. And so they not only have tea leaves available to them for the caffeine, they also have poppy available, opium available to them for the pain. So they get through the pain so they can keep doing the same stuff, the same work, right, endlessly. Now, but the ability to refine these drugs, right, instead of being the solution to the problem of how to get workers to work, became the problem interfering with profits. And in fact, as soon as cheap gin became widely available in Europe in the 18th century, it was denounced as anathema to productivity, and it became seen as a social sin and a social eyesore. As soon as the health insurance premiums caught up with the businesses who had cigarette coffee breaks morning and afternoon, you notice that the coffee break went the way of the dinosaur, although the coffee, which you can carry with you, keep at your desk, and doesn't result in heart disease, emphysema, and other medical conditions for which the health insurance that the company's paying for would have to pay, they're fine with you having the coffee. Just keep that up, that'll be great, but now they're no longer enforcing, or they're no longer supporting the cigarette break. It's hard to overstate the role that economic and political power has played in shaping the phenomenon of addiction in the United States. And I have to contrast this with Australia, because I did this podcast interview with an Australian podcaster last week, and he was just dumbfounded that we have a treatment industry of the size and magnitude that we do. And he says, are you sure that addiction is just this kind of medical problem? Is it not just life? Isn't it just hard, and don't you just have to get over it? And I said, well, let me tell you something about that, and I'll tell you too, because it's not a secret. Who gets to decide who's an addict is often a result of political power. The war on drugs that's characterized America's attitude toward drugs with horrific social consequences was the result of conscious choice on the part of the Nixon administration to gain control of threatening Black Panthers and other activist groups, and they were targeted for heroin use, and those annoying hippie war protesters who were targeted for cannabis. That's why marijuana and cannabis are listed as Schedule I drugs. That is, those drugs that have no legitimate use. You don't have any excuse for being found with them under federal regulations, and that's prevented even research on them. While OxyContin and fentanyl, which are listed as Schedule II drugs, and so you could give a story about why you've got them, even though they're more deadly than the ones that I just mentioned. So let us turn away from the drugs themselves for a minute. And as our society did in the beginning of the 1930s, by the way, and look at the addicts. In order to get prohibition repealed with the 21st Amendment, it was necessary that conceptual change regarding alcohol's danger be effected. That was accomplished by focusing on the addict as a person with an illness, a person born with a predisposition to a disease. Once this disease model was launched with the help of some very energetic AA founders, and one proponent who happened to also be a successful PR agent, the disease model found its way into American culture. It was prevalent by the 60s and 70s. Finally, in 1987, the AMA, and then 2 years later, the World Health Organization, accepted the diagnosis of alcoholism and then addiction, and which meant that third-party payers, insurers, could now pay for addiction treatment. The result of that? Well, among other things, there are now 11,000 addiction treatment centers in the United States, where $35 billion was spent in 2014. They are remarkably ineffective, but they get paid through insurance, and people want to put somebody there, so they go. They send them. Who goes to rehab? Well, generally those who disrupt the status quo, either by their use of alcohol or by their use of drugs prohibited by federal regulations, if they avoid prison. Now, there is an article that I just looked at the other day, I think is revelatory of how this works. The name of the article is How Heroin Got Me into Prison and How White Privilege Got Me Out. This is largely the distinction between who's in prison and who's in rehab. Populations who are in prison tend to be people with lower incomes, people of color, people who are located in certain neighborhoods, which means that they're lower income and marginalized. Wealthier people get sent to rehab, which isn't necessarily better, but it is, well, it is actually. It's a whole lot better. It's not even the same thing. It still sucks, it's just way better, but you know, on that continuum of suckiness, there's a pretty big one. So, yeah, anyway. So let's talk about the prison side for a second. Illegal illegal drug use and sales accounted for 2/3 of the rise in the federally incarcerated population and half of the rise in state incarcerated populations between 1985 and 2000. And it isn't just anybody who is included in this rise in the incarcerated population. The commonly cited statistic, we could ask Sarah Tyson if it's still accurate or if it's gotten worse, is that while African American males constitute about 6% of the general population, they constitute about 35% of the prison population. And that's just one subgroup of the disproportionately incarcerated. The populations with high incarceration rates are generally those that suffer from poverty and marginalization, as well as exposure to violence, poor nutrition, less available stable work, inferior jobs upon release, which just pushes the cycle another level and people further down the poverty well. These circumstances result in living situations marked by high levels of stress for everyone involved, which, as I mentioned in another talk and in chapter 3 of this book, render not only children but also the children in these particular environments as especially vulnerable to drug use and abuse. Now, compare that to prescription drug use. 3 times as many people die every day from prescription meds as die from heroin, cocaine, and meth together. In 2012, drug overdose was the leading cause of accidental death, and 53% of those were caused by pharmaceuticals. Of those, 73% were, unsurprisingly, painkillers. Meanwhile, the rate in the rise of pharmaceutical companies' revenues is stunning. Eli Lilly's profits rose from $875 million in 2003 to $23 billion in 2010. As a result of the Medicare Prescription Drug Act of 2003, the pharmaceutical industry saw an $8 billion increase in profits, and the group of legislators who led the fight for that plan each received hundreds of thousands of dollars of campaign contributions from these companies for their victory. So focusing on individual addicts' disease, or blaming the addict for moral failure, consistent with poor choices, is clearly overly simplistic. Whatever suffering comes from addiction, we can be sure that it's far more complex than the treatment industry believes or would lead us to believe. Now, this is a problem that I have characterized as a problem that is a function of a complex dynamic system, which means that there are innumerable layers of interconnected, non-linearly causal loops. And so, because I've said that contributors to addiction will include genetic factors, epigenetic factors, psychological attachment to parents, too much or too little, trauma at any stage, but particularly early childhood trauma, the way in which meanings develop for us, and I can talk about meanings, I've left that whole discussion out, social systems in which we are reared, and larger social environments in which we inherit entire cultural prejudices and attitudes, suggests that how in the hell is anybody going to ever do anything about addiction when you just made this problem that's out of this world crazy complicated? And that's actually not such a big deal. Because the level of the phenomenon of addiction can be analyzed at so many levels, and because complex dynamic systems are characterized, among other things, as having lever points, wherein very small inputs at one place can cause huge changes in outputs further down the road. Think about when you just drop grains of salt. You got a handful of salt, right? You put just grains of salt and you let them go one at a time. They make a pile, they make a pile, they make a pile. You do one more grain of sand and the whole thing slides to the side, right? Some break is made. That's a lever point in a system. And remember that human beings are adaptive, complex dynamic systems, which means that we respond to the environment that we're developing in and created by. And so we change the environment as we are being changed. And so this is a massively interactive kind of condition. So it's a wicked problem, as sociologists and politicians, environmental scientists call it. But that doesn't mean that there's no way in, right? Because the small changes can cause big changes somewhere else. We can have changes, and it has actually, I've observed it myself, that people have been able to overcome addictive patterns simply by starting something as simple as a core habit. A core habit could be something like making your bed every day when you get up, going for exercise every day for 30 minutes. Because these kind of core habits then incline people to attach other habits, like eating slightly better, and we're going to talk about the value of that, and doing, changing other things and getting more regularity in the life. And for some reason, getting more regularity in the life seems to trigger the capacity of people to manage their substance use. So manage to the point of, in many cases, stopping use. But, for some other, recommendations, habit is one element of addiction. Yeah, it is true. People say, oh, I don't know, I got in the car and I ended up at the liquor store. I don't know what happened. I was at a philosophy conference, I haven't smoked in a year, and I found myself with a cigarette. I don't know, what happened? There are automated behaviors involved, but that is not the essence of addiction. It's one element of this multifaceted phenomenon. But look, here's another thing we could do, and some people are attempting this one. Residential centers could stop focusing on AA and God and try. If they think it's a disease, then telling you to go to God is the same as turning you into an ancient Greek and making you go pray to Asclepius and hope something's going to happen. Nothing wrong with Asclepius, and I think, in the context, it's an outstanding method. It's just as good as many ways of getting treatment. But these places that have everybody go sit together all day long with a bunch of other addicts and alcoholics does not change the pattern. It doesn't do anything to get deeply enough into this pattern. They might want to try some evidence-based approaches. No. At the molecular level, treatments like Campril for cigarette cessation, naltrexone for alcohol dependence have been shown to be somewhat effective. Suboxone is an opiate substitute that's helped many of those with opiate attachments. It's safer than methadone. Also, cognitive behavior therapy has a certain amount of success, as do other types of psychotherapies that prepare individuals to expect and manage a certain amount of discomfort, emotional pain, angst, boredom. We have a problem in this culture that we think we're not supposed to suffer, ever, anything. You got a problem? Take a pill, right? But that's not actually the way of the world, and it's not even good for us. So you can't have a headache, you can't have a stomach ache, you can't have an addiction because we need to find a pill and fix you. But one psychological method that's often employed is helping people to understand the nature of the human condition, and that there will be emotional emptiness, there will be problems, there will be suffering, there will be stress, and providing tools for dealing with that. Some mindfulness practices have been incorporated along with these kind of strategies and have shown to be fairly effective in this regard. A drug already on the market for hypertension has been found to block a particular kind of ion channel that appears not only in the heart and in the blood vessels, but also in the brain. It seems to reverse the firmly attached neural networks that seek the associations between memories, cues, and behavior, motion, action. Memories, cues, do the drug, right? It's very tight neural connection. This one hypertension drug has shown some success at breaking apart those neural connections. Moreover, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies has done major studies at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and most recently at Boulder, looking at the use of psilocybin for depression and anxiety. They found that it's also extremely effective for certain types of, treating certain types of addiction. At the Johns Hopkins, they've been using shrooms for smoking. So, and it's really successful. It's impressive work. They're using LSD at Stanford in these smoking cessation treatments. And the point is that what seems to happen with these hallucinogens is that they depress the level of activity across the brain, somehow allowing some of these deep neural, very strong networks to break apart. Whereas typical numbers of people who stay free of smoking through other treatments rest at about 35% after 6 months. These researchers, and now I'm talking about the psilocybin addiction ones, and that the LSD ones with cigarette addiction had even better success, and that was over 80% over a 6-month period. And the thing about treating somebody with hallucinogens is that you have 1 to 3 treatments over a lifetime. It's over about 3 weekends. At the end of that, you're no longer on Campril for the rest of your life. You're no longer on Wellbutrin for forever. You're no longer on antidepressants or whatever. Moreover, in the case of the psilocybin trials, 87% of those in the Johns Hopkins studies rated at least one of their psilocybin sessions as among the 10 most meaningful experiences of their lives. And the vast majority said that their well-being was increased very much, as an effect of the experience. 68% said they had experienced shifts in priorities in such a way that they recognized that a desire to smoke and it just didn't matter anymore. Just couldn't care. Now, I'm not here to turn everybody on to hallucinogens. I'm just saying that we're not doing a great job at looking at the abundance of approaches that we could be taking to this disease. Finally, study of the microbiome in the gut shows that certain bacteria's presence or absence in the gut lining, we just don't appreciate how much of us actually is not us, right? There are 10 times as many, in terms of numbers, bacteria cells in our bodies as there are human cells. But the microbiome has been found to affect our autoimmune system in significant ways, and recent research shows that it has powerful effects on things like depression, anxiety, and even alcoholism. So altering the microbiome in some way, and those probiotics they sell you in the store are not going to do it, so don't try. But they could, at some point, be shown to be helpful in alleviating addictive symptoms. Last tiny bit here. Other things, though, that can prevent and ameliorate addiction have everything to do with our harsh social treatment of those who fall into bad places because of addiction and alcohol use. Studies in Pakistan and in Colombia showed that people suffering with addictive symptoms often cited social disorganization, poverty, harsh working conditions, and all of those things as their reasons for beginning to take drugs. And we know that adolescents who have experienced 5 or more of those adverse childhood experiences, those include things like having mental illness in the family, having a divorce, having parents who are abusive, neglectful. More than 80% of women who've had addictive problems have had sexual abuse problems. So any of these there's a whole list of these adverse childhood experiences, but for every one that a person has had, they're 2 to 4 times more likely to indulge in drugs as teens. Now, why is that relevant? It's because our brains develop myelin, which is the insulating stuff that makes the signals go through the pathways between neurons fast and effectively, right? It develops in us from the back of the brain to the front. And the problem with teenagers is that it takes, for one thing, it takes until ages 22 to 25 for men, ages 18 to 23 for the brain to completely develop, by which we mean the thinky parts getting hooked up with the acty parts, getting hooked up with the emotional parts, right? And so what happens is there's not the kind of impulse control, there's not the kind of control over emotions and all of that happening until, and I kind of like this one, I just learned it from Jim Grigsby in psychology last week, and it's just spiteful, I'm not even gonna say, okay, I'm gonna say that. Some it's a not small percentage of the population of males that developmental process doesn't end until age 40. So you're vulnerable to addiction because of this impulse control absence, right? So, I mean, I actually like that a whole lot because I have a son who's 34 and he was really alcoholic in his 20s, and I thought, oh no, this is never going to go away, he's going to die and all of that. But he's, happily married, he's got 3 kids, he's a wonderful father, he's very busy and all of that. He's just not a 25-year-old myelinator. He just took him a little while to get that thing part hooked up, and now he's doing great. One more thing. There's a study in the Richmond City Jail that's really well known because of this. It showed that helping to create meaningful life for prisoners and providing opportunities for reintegrating into society after incarceration decreased their recidivism rate by 20%. And even for those who did recidivate, there was a significant increase between time of release and time of reincarceration. With 6.9 people, 6.9 million people incarcerated in the United States as of 2011, and 80% of those addicted to alcohol or some other drug. This is a very important fact. Following Portugal, we could talk about that later, in turning our resources to treatment rather than to incarceration and punishment, ostracization, would help those numbers tremendously. So my last level of analysis about how do we treat addiction is really, really big, and people say you're really, really idealistic and ridiculous because you're never going to fix things like that. But I'm a philosopher, and I have hope, and I believe that your generation is better than mine. So that's all I have to say today. Unless you're really old and you're a professor like me.
We do have time for questions and answers.
Sarah, because she's got to go.
Okay, thanks. So I have a question about the transferability of the kind of analysis you're making. And it's CPR, Colorado Public Radio, did a story this morning. They found the cause of anorexia.
Oh, yeah.
Did you hear that?
No, but
Okay.
it's the same kind of thing.
Well, part of the reason I have a question, it's the deadliest form of mental illness, anorexia. And they were saying that they did brain scans of people who have anorexia and then people who don't. And people who have anorexia don't respond to sugar water the same way that people who don't have anorexia respond to it. They seem to be able to override the appetite center of their brain, and so they said this is the cause of anorexia, is this ability of the brain. I was just wondering if you thought that this kind of analysis that you're running here might be helpful in thinking through a complex mental illness like anorexia.
I don't have any expertise in here, but I can say that I can see. Look at the results that we're talking about. Brains of anorexia patients don't process sugar water in the same way that So what? That's one thing, right? That's maybe found in all kinds of other populations as well. We have to look at exactly what the scans show and how far that can be extrapolated. But that is never going to explain the whole, I can't please everybody and I have to take the world on because it's my responsibility because I'm the oldest daughter, or I've been sexually abused, or whatever the things are that alienate one from one's body. I think, and number, in fact, people have asked me, what are you going to do next? And I said, not addiction. So, but I do think that some of these other very complex psychological problems that are rooted, I mean, we have not always had anorexics, so you can't say that anorexics don't exist in every society. But clearly, this is not simply a function of the brain processing sugar water. So, let's just stop talking like that about these things and really take on problems for what they are.
Thank you.
I mean, it seems to me like AA kind of has a stranglehold on the treatment industry. What would you recommend we do instead, and how would you fight that?
One thing I've done to fight that is I've given keynote speeches at the Life-Ring Secular Sobriety Group national conferences. Gabor Mate has been there, Saj Ravsby has been there. A number of us have given talks at those national conferences over and over and supporting those groups, like on National Recovery Day or on Denver Recovery Day. There are big things going on. They have big, large-scale events. And I think promoting alternatives, smart recovery, right? Those options, at least with respect to LifeRing, which is the one I know the most about, they are willing, they provide one thing that seems to be important. One of the things I told you was that a big stressor for human beings is being isolated, being separated. It's true of all primates. So they've done the primate studies and shown when you separate one monkey from the rest of the little monkeys, it causes that they would rather have, they will respond much more strongly to the potential for presence of someone else than the potential for food. So it's a very big stressor, and therefore the social support, I think, is a really good idea, but the culty part, I think, is a really bad idea. And with respect to treatment centers, I think, right, the reason that they focus so much on AA is because you don't need any experts there. And while I know that that's popular in the United States right now, disrespecting experts is not the way to go if you really want to provide people who are paying a lot of money with help. So if you want to provide cognitive therapy, behavior therapy, EMDR, all of the other kinds of therapies, you've got to have people who are trained in them. And so putting evidence-based therapies in, of course, is going to cut profit margins, but it's also for those treatment centers who are virtuous and do spend the money and take the time, going to result in significantly improved recovery rates. But I do think that the social independent approach with the LifeRing people have a sort of a toolbox or a basket approach, and that's sort of the leverage, right? There are many different ways to leverage addiction treatment, and one of the things is to address the underlying trauma. One of the things, it's worked with a bunch of Vietnam vets. One of the things to do is to address underlying depression and anxiety. A number of things, but certainly secular organizations that are trying to do the same thing. It's really oversaid.
I have a question. You were talking earlier about mind, and this has been interesting to me lately about the brain and mind. Like, we've kind of ignored the brain as an organ, and created this ephemeral thing we call mind. And then I was thinking, well, the mind is created by the brain. So it makes sense to look at the brain as a functioning organ instead of some abstract idea called mind or abstract thing called spirituality or something. So I was wondering, in your studies, you talked a little bit about, brain function, how that could, looking at the brain as an organ and not looking at behaviors which are after the fact. There's something going on in your brain that's causing this behavior.
Yeah, well, that is the standard approach of the National Institute for Drug Abuse and a number of other people. In fact, we had this discussion last week when I was talking to the psychology department, because it is certainly a very important area of study. But you have to remember that the brain emerges out of that same self-organizing system as every other cell in your body, influenced and influencing by the environment that it is emerging in. The brain is not a thing which is separate from your body. It is integrated with your body as much as your blood is. It's right, so it's everywhere. And so we're looking at organisms. That's why I think it's so interesting that now the effects of that there is a connection between, because we always thought, oh, there's a blood-brain barrier, there's no connection between the lymphatic system and the brain. You can't get between the blood and the brain. There are no other structures available. We've seen them all, and it turns out, oh, guess what? There are yet other structures that connect the brain as it's supposed to be secreted away from the rest of the body. So it is an integrated part of the entire body, which means that treatments are not just of addiction, but of understanding what we are as organisms has to encompass our understanding of how our body-brain works as much as it does understanding how at the psychological level things work and at the social level things work. So I'm actually teaching a philosophy and psychology course this summer, because right now I'm doing an independent study with a neuroscientist from our campus, And I've found that bringing these things together, as hard as it is, because the categories are way different if you're a philosopher and you talk about mind and mentality and the psychology level of discussion and the neuroscience level of discussion, it's hard to bring it together and make sense. But that's what needs to be done. So that's the kind of work that he and I are doing, and that's what I'll be doing in the summer, trying to do a philosophy and psychology class in a way that answers your, or, meets the.
Does that mean I have to take the class this summer?
Yeah, you come join. Just come hang out when you're in the mood. Yeah. Okay, and I saw the other one right there.
I was gonna ask you, given all the treatments that you mentioned, do you think the single most important thing, other than the treatments, is a person's will to break the addiction? Because a lot of people that have an
But the
addiction,
question I would have for you is, what do you think the will is?
or motivation to break it. Because a lot of
Okay,
people
but
I know.
motivation we can break down, right? Motivation we can talk about in terms of neural systems. We can talk about it in terms of psychological effects that other individuals have on us. But to talk about the will itself. Now, although I have to say that I was raised a philosopher, not a psychologist, and so I was a Leibnizian most of my life, and that means that I should have things to say about the will, but I don't. I don't think it's a thing anymore, although there is willfulness and there is motivation, and there are. But one of the things that interests me the most, and I've been thinking about this for at least 10 years, is what that difference is between those people who have high motivation levels and it doesn't connect with motor cortex. It doesn't connect with putting those things actually into operation, and people who do. So there are a lot of people who just don't have any motivation. We could talk about what that system looks like. There are people who just don't care. And they'll okay, I'll hang out, I'll be a dope addict all my life. Whatever. Then there are people who are going to be, no, I really want to go to school, I want to do this. And they tell me all the time how they want to do these things and they don't. And so then there are other people who say, I want to do this, I want to do that, and you watch them just following through those things. And I think that there will be something to say about that from the neuroscience, psychological side, but they're going to need philosophers to help interpret what it is they're actually finding when they say, well, here's a motivational circuit, and here's what, because we know, I can tell you a story right now about dopamine available in the anterior cingulate, but that really doesn't seem to get at what we mean when we say he wanted to do it and he did it, right? It's so I can tell you a story about that, but just willpower in the way that people like to talk that word, I don't know what to say about it without doing some sort of cashing it out in terms that I could evaluate, other than to say, he has it, she doesn't, he has it, she does, and right? Because that thing is an ephemeral kind of thing that we use that word for, but I think the word is hiding something else.
Yeah, I guess kind of on that same topic, could you say that all addicts are faced with a hard choice, not no choice?
Sure. Absolutely. Actually, there's an entire section in the first chapter, I don't know, some chapter in this book that says that addiction is, so some people think that addiction is like akrasia, right? Weakness of will, and so we bring in the Aristotelian category, the Cartesian category, we talk about wills and all that, and I don't know what to do with that. But it means something like doing what you judge not to be the best thing. And we all do it. So why does that happen? It has a lot to do with attention and desires and all of that. But then there is a view that says addiction is a compulsion. And we kind of have a little bit of handle on what compulsions are. Psychological compulsions and where they come from, if you talk about the physiological sources. But, so there's a whole section in this book where I go through all of the possible things that compulsion could mean, and then every single one of them, when you push on them, falls apart. So there is no compulsion for human beings. It feels like there is often. Sure, I couldn't do anything else. Well, I bet you could. Because there really is there's nothing that would make an absolute break, and that would make it impossible for you to, unless it's a physiological barrier, you're in prisoner in chains or something, then of course you wouldn't be able to, but just you couldn't make up your mind to do something. No, you have to overcome a lot of other competing energies, desires, and voices in yourself.
I just had a second part too. You think it's fair to say that addicts lack self-knowledge, meaning that their actions don't match up with their intentions when they're trying to quit, and the self-deception from 12-step programs fills in that gap of self-knowledge because it helps them kind of overcome that demoralization that occurs from...
Now wait a minute, what does it do? I'm sorry, because you were saying the self-deception of AA instead of, so I think I missed a word.
Yeah, because with this conception of disease being this relapse disease, that usually
okay,
pretty
I see.
And then it kind of removes that guilt from the addict because then they have this
Here's the
inner
problem
addict.
with that. I think that there's something that was the intention. The intention with calling addiction a disease was to remove stigma so that people could feel free to go for treatment and to do something about it. Go tell their friends and all of that. The problem is, if I tell you that you have this disease, it is, right, not only self-fulfilling, but it is ontologically far too strong. Because if I say you do, that we know this with our little kids, right? We tell little kids, you did this and I did not like that. We don't say you are bad. Why? Because you say that and it will come true. You say that and you moralize them from the jump. So when you say you have a disease, there's a suggestion here that it was intended not to be, it was intended to remove stigma, but now it seems to add stigma because they say she is an addict. He's a dope addict. He's an alcoholic. And that by itself already marginalizes, ostracizes individuals when they think that, no, you know what, I have a problem right now. Because it's a temporal problem. We are processes. We come into the world, we go out of the world, and all the time in between we constantly change. So addiction is a process that takes place within individuals, and guess what? In most individuals, it disappears by the age of 35 or 40. Now the myelination thing's starting to come in and tell us a little bit, but it disappears in the vast 75% of the people by the time they're 35 to 40, even if they look like hopeless addicts earlier on. So what we see is, and why? Gene Heyman from Harvard looks at 4 major studies, and he says, what causes people to turn, and this addresses your question too, is that they're motivated powerfully by something else. In my son's case, for example, he has this family, these dogs, this job that he wants, these things that are meaningful activities that give him sense of value and things to do. When people decide, I'm going to go to law school and I can't do that and do drugs, I can't handle it all, then if they really want that one thing, the other thing falls by the wayside. And since this happens to the majority of people, I don't ever want to say that somebody has a disease in the way that I say you have diabetes, because I don't have a lot of way to help you out of that except treat it the rest of your life. And that's what AA does. And you're, like my Uncle Thurman, still going when you're 95 and you haven't drunk since you were 40. It's not a problem if people like it, they like it and it's good, and I would never take anything away from anybody that does anybody any good. I don't mean to say that. I just mean to say that there are many, many other things going on here, and there are many, many other ways that we might be approaching this problem, and we need to understand it as a temporary condition that can be grown out of, changed out of, moved out of, treated in some way with, whether it's chemical ways or social ways or meditation or any of the other. The other thing I was going to say about the microbiome and is that so Sarah Tyson and I both have a tendency to treat ourselves with massive amounts of kale when we have stress and I mean not just then but kind of all the time. And there is some evidence that that diets that are high in fiber and high in whatever it is, those things that are available in cruciferous vegetables and kale, that diets that are high in these It's not just the antioxidants, it's something else. But they act as probiotics. And acting as probiotics, what they do is they allow the development of certain kinds of bacteria, which seem to be the kinds that are good for us in being able to manage anxiety and depression. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say. Oh, and I'm sorry. Can you hang on just a second? She has some first.
So I have patients that are addicted to prescription drugs,
Yeah.
and when their doctors don't wean them off and then cut them off, they go through withdrawals.
Mhm.
But they kind of don't. They're not content in it, but they just suffer through the withdrawal.
Yeah.
Is that because they aren't being? Are you saying it's not because they're not being labeled as addicts, that they're just kind of there suffering through it, getting over it?
So this is a great question because the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the American Psychiatric Association puts out for diagnosing people and stuff, used to talk about substance use and dependence. So there were substance abuse disorders, and there were dependence disorders. And so a person, you can be dependent, and this is one of the reasons that I found that the addiction model just falls to pieces when you try to push it, is because you can be dependent on drugs as a result of your back surgery, and you're getting a lot of OxyContin and all of that, and then you don't get weaned off it. And when you do come off, you will be physiologically dependent, by which I mean you're going to be uncomfortable coming off of it. But people who don't have the psychological element that accompanies that just recognize that discomfort as sort of the discomfort that you have coming out of surgery, and it's just going to be part of that whole thing, and so they just endure that, and they don't have the same kind of psychological attachment, which is another element, which has to do with cues and memories and things, other associations that are made in positive ways that give it a very unnaturally positive valence. Yeah, so they don't have the same sort. So now they don't even talk about the dependence thing as distinguishable from addiction, and I think they should, because I think that is a different phenomenon. Okay, I'm sorry.
So you talked a lot about like the biological traits of addiction and how like infants can receive it if their parents were addicts. Do you believe that addiction as a disease is a trait gained by social pressures or circumstance, or do you believe that you have to have the biological trait of addiction to become an addict?
I don't even know what a biological trait of addiction would be. All I know is that everybody has some genetic structure and some, because I mean, when you think, you couldn't even begin to code for addiction, and you couldn't find something like that in genetics, because we're talking about brains with 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion neural connections that are integrated in entire bodies and so you can't even talk about, you can talk about certain alleles that code for certain kinds of proteins are more often associated with people, and that's a really loose kind of way of talking. Associated with people who eventually become addicted if all of these other things are met. And so we've got a whole constellation of things that are required conditions for an addiction to emerge, and that can only ever be one of them.
So we'll need to wrap up for those people who are getting to
Yeah, we got class.
But we have lots of food down here, so please take some as you go out, and let's thank